Hello, this is Attorney Brown Pendergraft with the Pendergraft firm, and I'm an attorney that is licensed to practice law in both Maryland and in DC. And the topic for today's video is, should I put my property into an LLC or a trust fund? Now, that is the exact phrasing of a question that was asked to me by a potential client. That's why I phrased it that way. But I figured that it would be a good video for a presentation. So here we are. I'm doing it. All right, so I have to first give a quick disclaimer. This is legal information. This is not legal advice. So for legal advice, you can contact an attorney that is licensed to practice law in your jurisdiction. If you're in Maryland or DC, feel free to hit me up, I guess. All right, moving on. So here is my here are my thoughts. So if you don't want to watch this video, I'm going to see if I can run through all of my thoughts as quickly as possible in like a quick general overview. All right, so I'm going to give you guys the bullet point cliff notes. All right, so here we go. Number one, so this isn't an either or question. You don't have to put your property into just an LLC or into just a trust fund. You can put it into an LLC owned by a trust fund or into a trust fund that is that holds the LLC. And so again, it's not an either or question. So you can, and that type of planning, it's maybe overkill for some, but that said, if you're a, I don't know, multi-millionaire business mogul, then that may be very beneficial for you in order to do your planning like that. This brings me on to my next point. Point number two, grandma's house probably doesn't need an LLC. So on the other hand, I went to the other opposite end of the extreme of the spectrum. Think of perhaps a retired grandmother with one property. She doesn't do any sort of business on the she doesn't do any sort of business activities on in that case, an LLC may not be the best idea, essentially, because I think that some estate planning, maybe with a trust, maybe without a trust, but on the other, it sounds to me like just estate planning in general will better serve grandma's needs in that case. Point number three is on LLC maintenance costs. So it does cost money to maintain an LLC, and my thoughts on that are, if you're in a jurisdiction that that costs almost nothing to maintain LLCs, I would even consider LLCs in situations where I wouldn't even recommend it here in Maryland, because again, the costs add up here in Maryland. But if you're in a place where it costs like, I don't know, $50 to have an LLC, then man, I have a bunch of them, why not? But here where I practice law, it tends to be a bit more expensive, so we can't just form crazy amounts of LLCs unless you got it like that, in which case you do, then go ahead and go for it. So point number four is on the spectrum of business planning versus estate planning, and kind of where you land in that spectrum. And so that will be to that can kind of at least point or lead me in a direction as to what kind of recommendations I would make towards you. To cite my examples above, grandma on the other hand, on one hand, we have grandma who doesn't really need too much business planning. She's not doing business in the state, and she may have, I don't know, grandchildren. So, and perhaps putting the house into a trust fund to make sure it gets to her grandchildren, like that may be a good idea. Whereas someone who's a multi-millionaire mogul, on the other hand, they may very well need lots of business planning, and who knows, maybe they need some estate planning as well, right? Maybe they want to set up a sort of real estate dynasty. So, yeah, so LLCs, and they may need multiple LLCs, right? All right, point number five, trust maintenance costs. So in point number three, I talked about LLC maintenance costs. Point number five, I want to talk about trust maintenance costs, which tends to be, I'm going to say it tends to be less expensive, at least for I'm going to get more into that in point number five. Point number six is avoiding probate. So LLCs and trusts can be used to avoid probate. And number eight, what about land trusts? So every now and then people contact me about land trusts and how they may help, or are they like the greatest thing ever, right? They may go to a seminar and someone's like, man, I hear land trusts are like the greatest thing ever. And if you're in a jurisdiction that recognizes land trusts, then they very well may be. But at least where I tend to primarily form trusts in Maryland, our code doesn't necessarily, our statutes we don't have it recognized in laws. So I don't think that we get those benefits from land trusts here that you may get in other jurisdictions that actually recognize land trusts. And that's it. So those are my thoughts. So well, then again, yes, let me back up real quick. So I generally tend to not recommend land trusts here in Maryland because if it's not coded into law, then we're not going to get those purported benefits and protections. So that's why I tend to not recommend land trusts. But again, if you're in a jurisdiction that has land trust, that's awesome. You know, we can definitely talk to an attorney that does land trust in your jurisdiction because that may be right for you as well. And yeah, so that's it. So you can click off the video now, or if you want me to get more in depth, you can stay. All right. So you decided to stay. So because you decided to stay, go ahead and click. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can click. You can like and subscribe for your boy. That would be great, so I can keep pumping out some this good old content. All right. So back to my first thought. This isn't an either or question when it comes to putting property into an LLC or a trust. Again, as I was saying, a property can be placed into an LLC owned by a trust, or it can be placed into a trust owned by an LLC. And perhaps you can make your children the beneficiaries of a trust that is owned by an LLC that holds the rental properties. So for my point here, I said that what if let's say you have 100 properties and 20 kids, and your goal is to create a dynasty. At that point, I may recommend making the children beneficiaries of a trust that holds an LLC that holds the property and proceeds from the rentals go from the trust and gets divided amongst the beneficiaries, essentially. So that's just what I said about 10 seconds ago. So yeah, look at me repeating myself like a good attorney does. And my last point here is that may be overkill depending on your situation. So it may very well be overkill. So yeah, so again, grandma probably doesn't need that sort of complex super planning, but all right, moving on. Point number 2, should grandma form an LLC? This is the opposite situation. To say if this person's only property is their primary residence, they do not rent or own any properties, or there's someone that is retired or working in a field where they're not likely to be sued, at least they're not likely to be sued personally. That's something to keep in mind. Like, say if you're like an attorney like me, or a doctor, or someone where even if you're not in the real estate business, but you're likely to be maybe sued personally, an LLC may be a good idea to just get properties out of your name, even if you aren't using the property for business purposes. Moving on to the next point, but if the property is not used for business purposes, again, that's a purpose that I would lean towards, not forming an LLC. And again, a limited liability company is overkill, and for grandma at least. And a trust might be just what grandma needs. As the point I say is that it might be what she needs because perhaps after her consult, we may decide that we may use a life estate deed as an estate planning tool instead of a trust or something like that. So that said, so a trust may or may not be what she needs. Again, we have plenty of other tools. The trust is just one tool in the toolbox, but estate planning is definitely what she needs. So whatever the right tools are, you can talk to an attorney and they can help you figure those out. All righty. Third thought, how much does it cost to maintain an LLC in your jurisdiction? So if I practice in a jurisdiction that costs $50 to form an LLC, and maybe $50 annually to maintain it, I may even put grandma's house in the LLC because why not? It costs almost nothing to do it. On the other hand, but that said, most jurisdictions cost a few $100s to do it, and then you're going to have to also pay annual maintenance costs as well. I think in Maryland we have to file our personal, I think it's called a personal property tax return. I'm not sure, my CPA kind of handles that for me, but I have to pay $300 just to file it. And like, my business doesn't really even own any property. Like, I just have like I do all my business on a laptop and a printer. But nevertheless, I still got to pay the state $300 every month just because. I also think that you need to when it comes to factoring in the maintenance costs of an LLC, I think it's especially if you're someone like me, you're going to need to hire a CPA and a bookkeeper in order to do that. So those costs should be considered in the upkeep costs as well. So I personally probably spend maybe $2,000 per year on CPAs and bookkeeping for my own LLC. And there's the other let's go on the flip side. There is on the opposite extreme, there are some jurisdictions that may charge ridiculous fees in order for you to have an LLC, in which case you may want to have less LLCs. Alrighty, moving on. Fourth thought. The spectrum of a we call this multi-millionaire landlord dynasty versus you. I have two verses there. I got to take that second verses out. Versus you versus grandma. So what that's supposed to say is so there's a spectrum, right? So there's on one hand there's the multi-millionaire landlord dynasty. On the other hand there is grandma, and in the middle there is you. So the multi-million-dollar dynasty, they may need super comprehensive estate planning, tax planning, and liability planning. And grandma might just need a basic estate plan, but you are most likely somewhere in between, right? In between those two. So here are some factors that I like to consider is as far as at least what I think when advising clients, right? So the first one of the things I look at is, does this person operate a landlord business in any of the properties, or are they collecting any rent as money? In that case, I do think that forming an LLC is a good idea, because anything can happen on the property, right? A tenant can slip and fall, or I don't know, something can happen, things break, and then the tenant may be trying to sue you. I mean, you could even be a great landlord and things can go wrong. So if that's the case, I'll almost always recommend LLCs in that situation if you're operating a landlord business. Another thing to keep in mind is that, are there any other business activities happening on the property? So if you use the property as any other sort of business activity there, I guess the obvious example would be let's say a commercial property, right? I don't know, maybe you own a restaurant. We're not just talking about residential property here. Maybe you own a restaurant. Yeah, that's maybe a good idea for that to be put into some form of LLC. And another thing to think about is, do you have any dependent children? Because if you do, then I think that it's probably a good idea to have to at least consult with an attorney about some estate planning, right? Because at that point, a trust or a trust may be a good idea. I'm not going to say it is a good idea. It may be, you know what I mean? Again, it's one of the tools that we use when it comes to estate planning. But if I were to use a trust to put properties into the trust, we can maybe make you the what's called the primary beneficiary, and upon your passing, it goes to your children. That's one way we can cut it, right? And we avoid probate that way, which is another point that I'll talk about later. All right. So moving on to my fifth thought, that is trust fund maintenance costs. So I talked about LLC maintenance costs, and then there is trust fund maintenance costs, which is and if your costs, one of your concerns are costs, then a trust fund is or a trust is they can be cheaper. They can be a lot cheaper, actually. So if you're acting as your own trustee, you can pay yourself $0. And in the case of my grandmother example, she may perhaps appoint her children or maybe her grandchildren as her trustees in order to manage her estate for her, and they may be willing to do that for free. So that's cool, right? Family. On the other hand, there are professional trust companies that may charge a percentage of the assets that are under control. Say, for example, they may charge a 1.5%. They may, you may have $1 million in property, I guess, and they may charge 1.5% of the profit that you guys are making from the rent, right? Or so they may have a 1.5% maintenance fee. Now, these are these trust companies, they're typically something that I know someone like me, at least I don't have access to that yet. Hopefully one day I have millions of dollar, multi-million dollar real estate portfolio, and then I can contact the trust company and have them manage it for me. But, one day I'll get there. One day we will all get there. So, and also, at least where I practice law, there is no state annual filing costs in order to maintain my LLC. So I don't have to pay the state $300 every year for no reason with my trust or with a trust like I have to do with my LLC. So it's nothing to keep in mind. And lastly, CPA and bookkeeping costs may be similar to when using an LLC. So when you form a trust, you can set up a bank account, or you probably should set up a bank account, just like you would do a for an LLC, and you can have your bookkeeper let's call link your bookkeeper to it and have your CPA go through it and file that for you as well. But of course, they're going to charge you for that. So moving on to my next thought, avoiding probate. So both trusts and LLCs can be used to avoid probate. And that's always a good idea because probate is a pain in the ass. So you can have your LLC, what's it called? So that said, just because you have an LLC or you have a trust agreement, that doesn't mean that it's automatically going to avoid probate. So you want to make sure that your LLC operating agreement or your trust agreement have mechanisms in them so that your interest passes automatically, essentially, upon your passing without probate. That said, so you want to make sure that your agreements actually avoid probate. I highly recommend having them reviewed by an attorney, licensed practice law in your jurisdiction. All right, moving on to my next point, LLCs versus trusts for privacy. So both LLCs and trusts can be used for privacy. But in order to achieve the highest degree of privacy, you want to purchase the home with your entity if possible. The entity can be either an LLC or a trust. What I mean by purchase with the entity is you want to purchase with either the LLC or the trust and not with your personal name. Because the moment that purchase happens, your name is recorded in the local land records. So it's there. And then people can just search your name, the local land records, and they can see the property even after you purchase the property. Let's say you deed it to your you deed it to your LLC or you deed it to your trust. At that point, someone can still look up your name and see that you deeded it to the property, deeded it to a trust, and if we can tell, right? If I see a deed that is for no consideration, at that point I know, like, oh, okay, they own that trust that they deeded the property to. So in order to achieve the highest degree of privacy, you want to purchase the home not in your personal name, but in the name of the trust or in the name of your LLC, if possible. Another thing to consider when it comes to privacy concerns is that LLC articles of organization are public records in most jurisdictions. So you need to be careful what is in it. Again, if your goal is to achieve, maximum privacy, right? So if I, say, for example, if I want, I don't know, the Pendergraft firm, let's say the Pendergraft firm owns property, which it doesn't. But if it did, and if you look at my articles of organization, you would see, oh, okay, Brian Pendergraft owns that might have been a very bad example, right? Because, that was a horrible example because the Pendergraft firm is obviously owned by Brian Pendergraft. Maybe it could be owned by Byron Pendergraft, right? I have a brother. Bad example. I'm just going to move on to the next point. I think you guys understand my point. My next point is that some jurisdictions, LLCs are super private. So even if you were to perhaps, they don't necessarily require everything that let's say Maryland might, which is cool. So definitely try to understand what's going on in your jurisdiction and just how private LLCs may be. From what I understand, Wyoming and Nevada, they tend to be, or even Delaware, they tend to be more privacy oriented, business friendly places. But even so, if your LLC is going to be holding property, I think forming an LLC in that jurisdiction is probably the best way to go. Unfortunately. Let's see. And lastly, there is no public record for trust agreements, or at least there is no mandatory public record. That's probably a better way to put it, because you could, I guess, record a trust agreement, right? So you could actually record a trust agreement, which is a tool that, may be a good idea to do. But That's it. There's no public record or no mandatory public record, right? So there's not like a trust database where someone can just pull up and then see like, okay, so who is the person who formed this trust, like there is with LLCs. So something to keep in mind, right? So I would say that trust may be slightly even more private than LLCs. I think that's fair to say. All right, so we got a clear win here for trust, because there's been no winner so far, really. Actually, no, trust kind of won when it comes to less money too, but then again, I think LLCs probably won when it came to like liability, though, right? Or did they? All right, so moving on, are land trusts the best thing since sliced bread? So I knew I had to do a particular thought on land trusts as well, because a lot of times people go to a seminar and then they'll hear about the amazing benefits of land trusts and they'll be like, yo, Attorney Pete, do you do land trusts? They're like the greatest thing of all time. And I'm just like, yo, I can if you really want to. It's just that I don't think that they necessarily give you the benefit. You know what? Let me just, I'll get to that. All right. So first, let me explain the main difference between a land trust and let's call it a standard trust. So the main difference between a land trust and a standard trust is that a beneficiary's interest, so is that the beneficiary, or let's say the person who is a beneficiary, right? I feel like I should define that. So the beneficiary is the person who is benefiting for the trust. So assuming that you created a trust for yourself, you're both you can both be the trustee who kind of controls the trust and the beneficiary, the person benefiting the trust. So in a standard trust, the beneficiary's interest in the trust is let's say in real estate in particular. It is in a standard trust, it is considered real property, versus in a land trust, it is not considered personal property. Now, this is actually it's game breaking, really. So what this means is that essentially there is more protection there in the land trust scenario, because so say someone can't get a say if someone can't get a real estate lien against personal property and then force a sale against you in order to collect on the judgment. So a land trust would sort of I guess block that, whereas on the other hand, a standard trust would not block that debt collection mechanism being used against you. So there's lots more let's call it, there's more protection when using land trust than when using a standard trust. Or is there? So the thing about land trusts is that they really only work in jurisdictions where the law recognizes them. So where I practice law in Maryland, we don't recognize land trusts. So I think that a land trust would end up getting treated just like a standard trust would. So for that reason, I typically don't recommend land trust to my clients, right? Well, at least they're forming in Maryland, because it's like, well, I know that, again, Maryland doesn't recognize land trust. So all those crazy benefits that you're going to get here in Maryland, you're not going to get them. Now, from what I understand, I think Chicago may recognize them. I think Florida may recognize land trust. I think Virginia may recognize land trust. I'm not exactly sure. Talk to a licensed attorney in your jurisdiction, because if your jurisdiction does recognize land trusts, then again, the benefits are kind of game breaking and skew my recommendation in favor of land trust. But again, that's if your jurisdiction recommends them. But that's why I never recommend them, because unfortunately, they're not all that recognized here where I practice. All right, moving on. Final thoughts. So there's not a one size fits all solution. So it's not like the LLC it's really that so let's say, so in your case, a LLC might be exactly what you need, and in someone else's case, a trust might be exactly what they need. And some people may need both, or some people may need neither. They just may need a basic estate plan that kind of covers everything, that can still avoid probate without a trust. There's a way to do that. Contact Attorney Pendergraft if you need help with that. Let's see. Moving on. Yeah, so I really don't think of one of them as better than the other. I think the best way to think of them is to think of them as tools. So again, they're just tools. They're just fictional entities that humans give powers for some reason, and we need to understand those powers and use them when necessary. And my last thought is that as you amass wealth or maybe have children, or this is life changes overall, your needs can change over time. So just because one tool may be right for you now, another one may be right in the future. So those are my final thoughts. And thank you for watching. Again, my name is Brian Pendergraft of the Pendergraft Firm LLC. You can visit my website at www.tpf.legal. Or if you want to talk to me, you can shoot me an email at info@tpf.legal. And thank you for watching.